They didn't just burn wood and stone, they burned memory, they burned names. They burned the bridges between the living and the divine. Across Yorubaland, fires consumed sacred groves. In Cross River, the voices of the Ekbe were silenced under rifle fire. The drums that once spoke to the gods fell silent, and priests, once revered, were hunted like criminals, called witches, and exiled from their own shrines. But this was no accident. It was a plan. A strategy wrapped in the language of civilization. Erase the gods, and the people will forget who they are. They called it progress. But it was erasure. A war not just on land, but on the spirit. Yet even in the smoke, something remained. Hidden in chants, carved in wood, possessed in the body. Secrets passed down not in books, but in breath. And now the wind is shifting, and the ashes are speaking again. When the priests burned the shrines, how Africa's sacred power was erased by force. In the heart of Yorubaland, long before the shadows of colonial conquest stretched across the terrain, there stood groves teeming with sacred breath. These were not merely forests, but consecrated realms, the home of the Orishas, divine forces who governed the seen and unseen. Orunmila, the keeper of wisdom and destiny. Ogun, the fiery pathfinder of iron and transformation. Osun, the gentle yet mighty current of femininity and healing. Each Orisha had a dwelling, a portal, a shrine, nestled within the embrace of nature. These shrines were not just places of worship, but seats of balance, memory, and ancestral guidance. Life moved through them and around them. They were the spiritual lungs of the people. British missionaries, armed with theology and torches, saw these groves not as sacred ground but as superstitious wilderness. With colonial officers backing them, they enacted a campaign of spiritual cleansing. Shrines were desecrated under the banner of civilization. Ritual tools, opal chains, carved staffs, sacred vessels were seized or destroyed. Sacred fires, kindled through generations, were snuffed out by decree. The priests and priestesses who once held communities together through divination, herbal knowledge, and spirit mediation were targeted. Some were arrested, others ridiculed or forced into hiding. The colonial rationale was blunt: to civilize the savage, one must first destroy his gods. Testimonies from elders, passed down in whispers and memory, recount how entire towns were forced to dismantle their groves or face imprisonment. Those who resisted were humiliated, paraded as relics of a savage past. The term idolater became a weapon of stigma, branding anyone who preserved Yoruba spirituality as unworthy of modernity. Missionaries preached redemption through erasure. If you abandoned your gods, you might be saved. If not, you were condemned both spiritually and socially. The psychological damage was vast. Generations grew up fearing the very names that had once guided their ancestors. Children were taught in mission schools to sing against the Orishas, to equate Ogun with Satan, to see their heritage as a curse. Ritual dances were replaced with choir hymns, traditional medicine replaced by foreign pills, ancestral wisdom displaced by imported dogma. The sacred drumbeat of the people was muted, and in that silence, something ancient fell asleep within them. But the groves had memory. Even burned, the earth beneath them remembered the footprints of the faithful. And not all bowed to the colonial gods. In secret, under moonlight, rituals were kept alive. Some priests fled deep into the forests, preserving their knowledge out of reach. Women whispered Orisha names while grinding food. Children played games that mimicked old rituals, not knowing they were echoes of the sacred. Yoruba spirituality became a language of resistance. Still, the scars run deep. Many Yoruba today carry the inherited fear of their traditions. Some will not speak the names of the Orishas aloud. Others question whether the gods ever truly left or were simply silenced by force. Cultural disorientation, an unmooring from the spiritual compass, was a deliberate goal of colonial conquest. By burning the groves, the colonizers hoped to sever the soul of a people. The revival is not just spiritual, it is political. To reclaim Yoruba spirituality is to reject the colonial narrative that demonized it. It is to say boldly that African ways of knowing, healing, and worshiping are not inferior but deeply sacred. Young people are traveling back to their ancestral villages to ask questions, to find the remnants of old shrines, to seek out elders who still remember. They are using technology, YouTube, podcasts, digital libraries, to decode what was nearly lost. And in doing so, they are reconstructing more than rituals. They are reconstructing identity. In the diaspora, the echoes of those burned shrines can be heard in Candomblé in Brazil, in Santeria in Cuba, in the revival of African traditional religions across Black America. The Yoruba Orishas traveled, hidden in the spirits of enslaved people, disguised under Catholic saints, surviving in rituals masked as dances. The colonizers thought they had extinguished the flame, but it had only dimmed, waiting for breath. Now that breath has returned, and with it the gods rise again, not in vengeance but in restoration. The groves that once stood in Yorubaland may never fully return in form, but in spirit, they are everywhere. Every altar built in a city apartment, every prayer whispered in Yoruba across the Atlantic, every child given an Orisha name, it is all part of the restoration. What was burned is being rebuilt, what was outlawed is becoming sacred again. And in this cycle of destruction and rebirth, we see the endurance of Yoruba cosmology. A people may be scattered, their temples desecrated, their chants forbidden, but if even one voice remembers, the spirit of the grove lives on. Across the forested heart of the Cross River region, the Ekpe society once stood as a spiritual and political compass for the people. More than just a secretive brotherhood, Ekpe was a living system, a court of justice, a guardian of law, a keeper of divine order. Its lodges were temples of discipline, mystery, and ancestral presence. The members of Ekpe were not only enforcers of ethical conduct, but also custodians of the sacred, mediating between the visible world and the realm of spirits. With elaborate rituals, coded language, and complex rites of passage, Ekpe held the community accountable to its ancestral responsibilities. Each initiation wasn't just a ritual, it was a rebirth into duty, secrecy, and the sacred. To colonial officials, this tightly woven fabric of indigenous authority was intolerable. The British did not see spiritual stewards, they saw resistance. The Ekpe society, with its encoded laws and independent rule, was a threat to colonial administration. By the 1890s and into the early 1900s, raids on Ekpe lodges were systematically executed. Masks, each a spiritual portal, were seized or incinerated. Drums were confiscated. Sacred palm fronds and regalia were trampled under military boots. The lodges, once resonant with chants and verdicts, fell into silence. The leaders of Ekpe were arrested, exiled, or worse, branded as subversives by a foreign system that neither understood nor respected their roles. One of the most devastating assaults was on Nsibidi, the sacred script used by the Ekpe society to record judgments, proverbs, and spiritual truths. Unlike the Latin alphabet, Nsibidi was visual, dynamic, and alive. Etched into walls, painted onto textiles, passed through gesture and dance. It wasn't just a writing system, it was a spiritual memory. Colonial schools declared it pagan. Christian missionaries called it devilish. Children caught drawing it were punished. Elders were warned to stop using it. In some villages, Nsibidi was erased overnight from those that had carried stories for generations. Psychological warfare was at the heart of the Ekpe suppression. Through public shaming, through church sermons, through mission school texts, Ekpe was no longer a symbol of honor, but of shame. The once revered initiation ceremonies were portrayed as cultic. The masks were reduced to primitive costumes. The divine voice behind Ekpe's rulings was drowned out by colonial edicts. Young people, eager to fit into the mold of Western education, began to see the lodge not as a place of power, but as a symbol of backwardness. But Ekpe was not so easily extinguished. Beneath the scorched walls of lodges and the silence forced upon drums, a pulse remained. Elders held on to the stories. Symbols were kept alive through body language, hidden etchings, and metaphorical storytelling. In some communities, the Nsibidi script survived, not in the classroom, but on calabashes, in mat weavings, on the carved doors of ancestral homes. What had been removed from public life was transformed into a hidden curriculum of cultural survival. Ekpe's power retreated underground, but it never vanished. The attack on Ekpe had long-term consequences. With the destruction of indigenous systems of governance, spiritual authority became unmoored. The colonial courts that replaced Ekpe rulings lacked cultural legitimacy. Disputes once resolved through ritual and mediation now faced foreign judges with no knowledge of ancestral law. Community trust eroded. Children born after the raids heard only fragments of Ekpe's truth, if they heard anything at all. An entire cosmology, once central to moral education and communal order, was reduced to taboo. Today, The legacy of suppression still lingers, but so does the spirit of resistance. In parts of Cross River, there is a quiet resurgence. The Ekpe masks dance again, not only for tourists but for ancestors. Nsibidi is being studied, documented, and revived by scholars and artists who understand that the script is not just visual, it is sacred. New generations are being initiated. Oral histories are being recorded. The lodges are not what they once were, but they are not gone. To honor Ekpe is to reclaim a truth deeper than history books allow. It is to remember that African governance systems were not primitive. They were profound, that the laws written in symbols, sung in chants, and judged through spiritual presence were part of a vast ethical architecture. The colonial project tried to dismantle that architecture. But like the carved lines of Nsibidi that refuse to fade, the memory of Ekpe refuses to die. What was once feared can now be revered again. The Cross River people, despite the centuries of erasure, still carry within them the rhythm of the drum, the weight of the mask, the language of justice older than any colonial gavel. Ekpe may have been forced underground, but beneath the soil, roots only grow deeper. In the diaspora, echoes of Ekpe have also resurfaced. Communities in Cuba, Colombia, and even parts of the Caribbean retain fragments of the society's rituals, masked within Catholic celebrations or coded language. The idea of a spiritual brotherhood that defends justice and upholds ancestral truth still resonates. As African descendants seek to decolonize their identities, many are looking back to Ekpe, not as a relic, but as a model. In Ekpe, they see a template of resistance, of rooted governance, of divine order without domination. Even in digital spaces, Ekpe lives. Artists incorporate Nsibidi into contemporary fashion and murals. Digital libraries are archiving surviving symbols and chants. Podcasts tell the suppressed stories. The very tools of globalization once feared as agents of forgetting are now being repurposed for remembrance. And through all this, the sacred power of Ekpe, that blend of mystery, order, and spiritual truth, begins to speak again. Not in fear, but in fire. In the sacred heartlands of the Efik people, spirituality was once carried not only by men, but by powerful priestesses who served as the pillars of ancestral worship and spiritual governance. These women were conduits between the seen and unseen realms, spirit mediums who healed the sick, resolved conflicts, and conveyed divine counsel from the ancestors. They walked with authority, wrapped in ritual cloth, guided by chants that summoned both reverence and awe. Their temples were places of equilibrium, where community found answers in times of crisis and peace during upheaval. But as British missionaries and colonial administrators swept through Calabar and its surrounding regions, these women were stripped of their divine titles and branded witches. Their shrines were desecrated, their names slandered. What was once sacred suddenly became dangerous, outlawed by laws imported from a world that refused to understand African metaphysics. In Igbo territories, juju was never a singular thing, but a diverse network of spiritual expressions. Charms made from herbs, stones, and sacred objects weren't mere decorations. They were encoded tools of spiritual defense, protection, fertility, and power. Altars were arranged with cosmic precision. Oaths were sworn not just with words, but with ritual actions that invoked ancestral witnesses and the wrath of divine justice should anyone lie. Priests and diviners maintained these systems with diligence, knowing the balance between the worlds depended on their fidelity. Yet, under colonial law, all of this became criminal. The British Witchcraft Ordinance and native customs laws cast a sweeping net over indigenous spirituality. Every charm became a fetish object, every oath a superstition, every ritual an offense against the Crown's new moral order. What was once public was pushed into secrecy. Those who had led their communities in spiritual matters now found themselves at risk of arrest, public ridicule, or worse. Spiritual items were confiscated in raids, sometimes burned in front of the same villagers who once knelt before them. In schools and churches, children were taught to fear the very names their ancestors had once spoken with reverence. Psalms turned into silence. Rituals turned into myths. Sacred dances became cultural exhibitions for tourists stripped of power and purpose. A dark fog of cultural shame settled over the people. To practice juju or consult a priestess was no longer a sign of wisdom. It became a whisper of scandal. Yet the erasure was never total. In the quiet folds of grandmother's wrappers, charms still hid. Beneath the foundations of old homes, sacred stones remained buried. Some Efik women continued their rituals under different names: dream interpretation, intuition, herbalism. Some Igbo diviners camouflaged their tools as crafts or decorations. Even as churches filled with hymns, the earth still received offerings at dawn. Spirits still walked the forests, still responded to the unspoken prayers of those who hadn't forgotten. Colonial laws may have criminalized the sacred, but they could not kill the spirits themselves. The gods were watching, waiting. The consequences of this spiritual silencing were far-reaching. Communities that once solved disputes through oracular guidance now faced courts with foreign laws and judges. People who once received healing through ancestral wisdom turned to hospitals ill-equipped to deal with spiritual affliction. Dreams once understood as prophecy were dismissed as delusion. The result was a population spiritually displaced, culturally fragmented, and silently aching for reconnection. But even in exile, the sacred found ways to survive. Stories carried in whispers, symbols painted into art, songs hidden in lullabies. Now, a new generation is asking forbidden questions. In Calabar, Efik festivals are being reimagined, not as relics, but as revival. In Shuka, scholars study charms once dismissed as primitive. The term juju is being reclaimed by those who see its power not as dark, but as deep. There is growing awareness that the colonizers' condemnation was not about truth, but about control. To demonize a priestess was to dismantle her influence. To ban a ritual was to cut off a community's connection to its ancestors. But today, from university lecture halls to forest altars, that connection is being restored. This is more than cultural renaissance. It is spiritual resistance. For centuries, African spirituality wore the mask of shame. Now, it wears the crown of rebirth. The Efik priestesses once labeled witches are being honored as healers, teachers, and historians of the soul. The juju priests once imprisoned are remembered as moral guides, architects of balance, philosophers in ritual form. The world may have tried to forget, but memory is not so easily erased. It lingers in soil, in songs, in silence. And when the people remember, the spirits respond. The journey to restoration is not without pain. The fear still lingers in language, in superstition, in law. Some communities still whisper instead of proclaim. But in the boldness of those reclaiming their names, rituals, and shrines, the tide turns. Spiritual practices once forced into darkness are returning to the light, not to dominate, but to heal. This is the work of remembrance. This is the fire that will not die. Across the sacred landscapes of Africa, the drum was never just an instrument. It was a voice, a spirit, a messenger. In Yorubaland, the bata drum sang to the orishas, invoking Shango's lightning, Osun's river of beauty, and the wisdom of Orunmila. It translated the unseen into rhythm, carried prayers from earth to sky, and called the community into spiritual alignment. In Igbo lands, the Igba was not mere percussion. It was the heartbeat of the village, resounding during festivals, initiations, and mourning rites. It carried ancestral language through sound, and among the Efik, the obodum drum marked sacred time, speaking during council meetings, funerals, and rites of passage with precision and reverence. These drums did not just echo, they testified. They carried memory, summoned the ancestors, and invoked justice. But to colonial eyes, these drums were dangerous. They were not understood as sacred. They were seen as signs of resistance, disorder, and paganism. And so came the decrees. In mission schools, students were banned from playing traditional drums. Hymns replaced ritual rhythms. The bata, igba, and obodum were labeled tools of idolatry, instruments of rebellion, dangerous symbols of a spirituality too alive to be controlled. The colonial state banned them in churches, in schools, and even in homes. In some areas, playing a ritual drum could result in arrest or beating. Elders who once drummed in public were forced into silence, or into the shadows of the forest, playing only at night, only in whispers. The silence was strategic. The spirit world, colonizers believed, could be silenced through its instruments. If you cut off the sound, you cut off the soul. Whole generations grew up hearing only European melodies. The rhythms that once defined community life were erased from ceremonies and replaced with imported musical codes. Rituals that had once included drum-driven trance now stood hollow, their power muted. The drum was forbidden not just for its sound, but for its potential. It had the power to unify, to remind, to awaken. It had the power to call gods down to earth. That power was deemed unsafe, and so it was outlawed. What was once central to African identity was now criminal, replaced by music that had no roots in the soil. But the beat did not die, it went underground. Elders passed on rhythms by memory in secret ceremonies and disguised folk songs. Some carved drums small enough to hide in baskets, others encoded sacred patterns into lullabies and clapping games. In the Americas, enslaved Africans reawakened the drum under new names: bongos, congas, atabaques. These were not simply innovations, they were acts of remembrance, of rebellion. The drum had crossed the Atlantic and survived the lash. It survived colonial bans, it refused to be silenced. Today, the sacred drum returns. Across Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, and Cameroon, young drummers are recovering ancient rhythms. They are no longer merely performers, they are priests of vibration. In ceremonies, in festivals, in the studios of Afrobeat, the traditional drum lives again. The Bata returns to Osun groves. The Igbo reclaims its place in Igbo naming rights. The Obodum echoes again in Efik processions. The silence imposed by colonial decree is being broken, rhythm by rhythm. What colonizers believed they had buried is rising, not just as music, but as memory, as soul, as defiance. To ban the drum was to attempt to ban the African heartbeat, but the beat was not theirs to control. It lived in the earth, in the palms, in the bones. It is the first sound we hear in the womb, and it is the last rhythm we feel before death. The drum is the breath of the ancestors. Its silencing was never permanent. Now it sounds again, not as an echo of the past, but as the prophecy of a people who remember. The drum is not noise. It is knowledge, and it will never be silenced again. Colonialism was not merely a conquest of land and labor. It was an orchestrated war against the soul. Beneath the guns and flags was a subtler, deeper violence. The erasure of sacred names, the mocking of spirits, the silencing of ceremonies that had defined African identity for millennia. The colonizers understood something profound, that if you could make a people forget their gods, you could make them forget themselves. So the assault began not only with bullets, but with Bibles, not only with chains, but with shame. Orisha, once revered as intercessors of balance and justice, were declared devilish. Ancestors, once sources of wisdom and protection, were branded as demons. Rituals that once guided life transitions were outlawed or laughed at, and children in colonial mission schools were taught to fear the very spirits their grandparents once called upon for healing and rain. This spiritual war was as calculated as it was cruel. Erasing a people's traditions was not accidental, it was an intentional strategy of domination. The colonizer knew that a people grounded in their spirituality could not be fully controlled. So they attacked the roots. Sacred symbols were confiscated, sacred groves burned, and indigenous priests demonized. Traditional leaders were replaced by colonial appointees who often had no understanding of or respect for ancestral law. The drum was banned. Divination was criminalized. Even the language of the spirits, the chants, proverbs, incantations was replaced by foreign tongues and doctrines. In the span of a generation, what was once holy became forbidden. What was once honorable became embarrassing. Children mocked their parents' traditions. Elders began to whisper their prayers in secret. The colonizers did not stop at labeling the gods. They rewrote entire cosmologies. The Orishas were reimagined as satanic beings. Ancestors became ghost stories. Offerings became witchcraft. Shrines were raised and churches built on their ashes. The psychological damage ran deep. In many families, a silence took hold, about names, about rituals, about the sacred. Lineages that once passed down spiritual roles now found themselves without memory. Where there had once been a priest or a diviner, there was now confusion, fear, or denial. People no longer knew their spiritual totems, their guiding deities, or the psalms of their lineage. They knew only that such things were dangerous or backward. And this was exactly what colonialism intended. This shame was the most dangerous weapon of all. It did not need soldiers or guns. It lived in textbooks, pulpits, classrooms, and laws. It shaped how Africans saw themselves and their past. If your gods are demons, if your ancestors are fools, if your rituals are crimes, then who are you? The result was a spiritual amnesia, one that still haunts many communities today. Families forgot not just how to perform rituals, but why they mattered. Towns forgot the names of their deities. Entire cultures stood on ancestral ground without knowing the spirits buried beneath it. But not all forgot. Some held on. In hushed tones around dying fires, the stories were still told. A grandmother hummed the old songs. A hunter still poured libation before entering the forest. A healer still remembered the herbs taught to her by an ancestor in a dream. These acts of remembrance, tiny, fragile, defiant, carried the memory forward. And now a new generation begins to listen, to reclaim, to remember. The strategy was clear. Erase the gods and you erase the people. But memory is not so easily killed. The gods were not demons. The ancestors were not ghosts. They were guides, guardians, and witnesses. They are still waiting, in the silence, in the soil, in the names that have not yet been forgotten. And when we call them back, we call ourselves back. While the fires of colonization swept through towns and villages, turning shrines into rubble and priests into prisoners, not everyone bowed to the new regime of silence. Resistance took many forms, and not all of them were loud. Some of the most powerful defiance lived in whispers, in shadows, in lullabies, sung under breath. Elders, holding tight to knowledge passed through generations, became silent warriors of memory. In hidden corners of homes, they whispered the sacred names, embedding divinity into the songs they taught to children, turning play into prayer and melody into maps of survival. Where ceremonies were banned, dances took their place. Not just performances, but encoded rituals, steps that mirrored the movements of gods and ancestors. Calabashes were not only used for food or drink, but became canvases of memory, etched with stories, cosmologies, sacred symbols only the initiated could read. Spirit possession, once open and celebrated, moved underground. In the bushlands far from colonial patrols, rituals continued under the stars. There the ancestors still came. The gods still spoke, entering bodies, shaking limbs, delivering messages. Even when the drums were banned, the earth became the instrument, feet striking soil, hands clapping rhythm, voices humming ancient songs that defied extinction. These ceremonies, though secret, became the heartbeat of cultural survival. They were not relics, they were revelations. Some families buried sacred items beneath their homes. Others disguised altars as ordinary shelves, masks hidden behind portraits of colonial saints. Offerings were made at dawn before the village stirred. A handful of words spoken to the wind carried the weight of an entire cosmology. Children were taught their spiritual names not in public rituals, but in private whispers. Knowledge passed from lip to ear like flame to wick. The gods, it turned out, did not need grandeur. They needed remembrance. These small acts of defiance were seeds planted in spiritual soil. They grew roots in silence and patience. And now they blossom in a new generation that is beginning to ask questions long deemed dangerous. They are asking who they are, where they come from, what was taken from them, and how to reclaim it. And through these questions, the memories encoded in lullabies, dances, carvings, and ceremonies are returning to the surface. What was once hidden for protection now emerges as power. This was not rebellion in the traditional sense. It was cultural preservation under siege. Every gesture, every chant, every mark on wood or skin was a refusal to die. It was the resistance of memory. And that memory, nurtured in secrecy, now stands at the threshold of resurgence. The gods were not gone. They were simply waiting, in calabashes, in dance steps, in whispered names, for someone to listen again. Across cities and villages, across continents and languages, a quiet resurrection is unfolding, led not by elders, but by their descendants. Young Africans and Afro-diasporans, children of the disrupted, the displaced, and the deliberately disconnected, are reclaiming what was once forbidden. Orisha names, once whispered in fear or buried beneath Christian hymns, are now spoken aloud with reverence, painted onto murals, etched into music, recited in prayer. The Bata and Igba drums, once criminalized as tools of rebellion, now resound in sacred circles, echoing through ceremonies and festivals. Shrines, long buried or broken, are being rebuilt, not as relics of superstition, but as living altars of identity and memory. From the Terreiro of Candomblé in Brazil to the Vodou forts of Haiti, from the revivals of Igbo Odinani in southeastern Nigeria to the ancestral rituals of the diaspora in New York, London, and Accra, the spiritual lineage that colonialism tried to sever is rising unbroken. These traditions endured, not because they were allowed, but because they were protected, hidden in songs, dances, dreams, and the defiant hearts of those who remembered. The generation now awakening does not see their spiritual past as something shameful to escape, but as a compass to return to. They seek not just ritual, but roots, not just power, but purpose. This is the generation the ancestors spoke of in prophecy, the ones the priests prayed for in silence as the shrines burned. They are not just discovering, they are completing the circle. Through digital platforms and village visits, through books, beads, and blessings, they are weaving back together a tapestry that was torn but never destroyed. They carry the flickering light passed down in secret, and now they lift it high for the world to see. And in that flame, the gods smile, not because they were remembered, but because they were never truly forgotten. They tried to burn the gods, but the gods do not die. They tried to silence the drums, but the rhythm found new hearts to echo through. They desecrated shrines, criminalized rituals, demonized ancestors, but memory survived. Beneath the ashes, the embers of the sacred never went cold. They flickered in lullabies and veiled ceremonies, in carved symbols and coded steps. And now, those embers are catching flame once more. The shrines may have fallen, but the spirit never did. It waited, in silence, in exile, in dreams, for this moment of return. Today we stand not only in remembrance, but in rebirth. To reclaim is to say, you did not win. To relearn is to honor what was hidden, not lost. And to restore is to become once again the sacred vessels our ancestors shaped us to be. This is not nostalgia, it is necessary. Because without our spiritual roots we wander in someone else's story. But with them, we awaken into our own. So we thank you for your attention, your courage, your willingness to listen to what others tried to erase. You are part of a lineage not broken, but rising. Share your stories in the comments, subscribe to stay connected, and most importantly, carry this remembrance forward. Protect it, live it, let it guide your steps, let it rekindle the fire.